The cold glass of the donation jar felt like a block of ice against Ansel's trembling fingers. Each crumpled dollar he pulled out was a betrayal of everything he thought he was. But the image of his son, Leo, lying in a hospital bed just blocks away was a far greater weight. He didn't see the barista's phone discreetly filming. He only saw the medicine he couldn't afford and the ticking clock on his son's life. It's a story that forces us to question the clear lines we draw between right and wrong. Before we get into it, I'd love to know what you think makes a person cross a line they swore they never would. Share your thoughts after you've heard Ansel's journey. The air in the Grind and Steep cafe was thick with the smell of roasted coffee beans and steamed milk, a comforting aroma that felt like a cruel joke to Ansel. Comfort was a luxury he hadn't known in months. His world had shrunk to the beeping of heart monitors and the sterile scent of antiseptic. He fumbled with the bills, his hands clumsy with panic. A 5, a 10, another 5. He wasn't counting, just grabbing. He could feel eyes on him. He didn't dare look up, but he felt the shift in the atmosphere, the quiet chatter of the cafe fading into a tense silence. The barista, a young man with kind eyes who had served him coffee on better days, was standing frozen behind the counter. For a moment, Ansel saw a flash of pity in the young man's face, before it was replaced by something else, duty maybe, or fear. The phone in the barista's hand was angled just so. Ansel knew what was happening, but he couldn't stop. He had to get the money. He had to get back to Leo. He shoved a final handful of crumpled bills into his worn jacket pocket and turned, his gaze fixed on the floor. He walked past the tables of strangers, their silent judgment feeling like a physical force pushing him out the door. He didn't run. He walked, fast and desperate, into the cold afternoon air, the little bell on the cafe door tinkling mockingly behind him. The next morning, the cash was a warm lump in his pocket as he sat beside Leo's hospital bed. His son, all of 8 years old, looked small and frail against the stark white sheets, a tangle of tubes and wires connecting him to the machines that kept him alive. Ansel used the money, $157 he'd counted, to pay for the first dose of a new medication. The hospital pharmacy had been adamant. Insurance wouldn't cover it, and they needed payment up front. Handing over the stolen, crumpled bills to the pharmacy clerk felt like trading one piece of his soul for a small piece of hope. For a brief moment, sitting back in the chair by Leo's bed, he felt a wave of relief. He had done it. He had bought his son another day. A nurse bustled into the room, her expression weary but kind. "Just checking his vitals," she said, her attention on the monitors. As she worked, she scrolled through her phone. "Can you believe some people?" she muttered, shaking her head. "It's all over the city's social page. Just disgusting." Ansel didn't pay much attention until he heard the name of the cafe. "The Grind and Steep," the nurse said. "Some guy just walked in and cleaned out their donation jar. For this hospital, can you believe it? Stealing from sick kids." She angled her phone, and Ansel's blood ran cold. It was his face. A grainy, pixelated screenshot from a video, his expression a mask of pure desperation. The cafe's logo was visible in the corner, and the caption was a dagger to his heart. "Theft. This man stole from sick kids. Let's make him famous." The post had thousands of shares. The comments were a torrent of hatred. His world, already so fragile, shattered completely. It didn't take long. Less than 2 hours later, 2 police officers walked into the pediatric wing. Ansel saw them from down the hall and knew they were there for him. They were professional, quiet, but their presence felt like a brutal invasion of this sacred, sterile space. They arrested him in the hallway, just steps from his son's room. He didn't resist. He just asked one of the officers if they could please tell the nurse in room 304 that Leo's dad had to step out. The ride to the station was a blur. The booking process was a series of humiliating steps. Fingerprints, photograph, the removal of his shoelaces. Each moment cemented his new identity. Not a father, not a carpenter, but a criminal. He was placed in a cold concrete holding cell with a thin mattress and a stainless steel toilet. The heavy door slammed shut, and for the first time, the full weight of what he'd done crushed him. He hadn't just stolen money. He had stolen any chance of a future. He had failed Leo in the most public way imaginable. Corinne Vance was scrolling through the local news on her tablet when she saw the story. She was a public defender, and her days were filled with the broken, the desperate, and the defeated. She was used to seeing the system grind people down. But this story, the man who stole from a children's hospital donation jar, was different. The public outrage was palpable. The news anchor spoke with a tone of disgust. Yet, when they showed Ansel's mugshot, Corinne didn't see a monster. She saw a man who looked utterly haunted, his eyes filled with a despair that felt ancient. It was a look she'd seen too many times before, the look of someone who had been pushed past their breaking point. On a hunch, she put aside the case files she was supposed to be working on and drove down to the county jail. She wasn't assigned to his case, but something compelled her to try. She met Ansel in a small, windowless visiting room. He sat across from her, slumped in his chair, refusing to make eye contact. He looked smaller than he had in the mugshot, swallowed by the oversized orange jumpsuit. "Mr. Reyes," she began gently, "my name is Corinne Vance. I'm a public defender. I saw your story, and I'd like to offer my help." Ansel didn't move. He just stared at the gray table between them. "There's nothing to help with," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I did it. Everyone saw me do it." "There's always context," Corinne pressed. "The law is about more than just the act. It's about the why. If you let me, I can talk to the DA, maybe work out a deal." He finally looked up and his eyes were hollow. "I don't want a deal. I'm guilty. Just let me take whatever they give me. It's what I deserve." He was completely shut down, wrapped in a blanket of shame so thick that her words couldn't get through. He was rejecting her, rejecting the only lifeline he had, convinced that punishment was the only path forward. Corinne left the jail that day with a heavy heart. She had failed her first attempt. The man was determined to fall on his sword, and if she couldn't break through his wall of guilt, the system would be all too happy to let him. Corinne was not one to give up easily. Back in her cluttered office, she started digging. She ran Ansel's name through the court system and found nothing, not so much as a speeding ticket. This wasn't a career criminal. This was a man who had never been in trouble with the law in his 42 years of life. So what had changed? Her first call was to his last known employer, a construction firm. They told her he'd been laid off 3 months ago during budget cuts. He was, they said, one of their best carpenters, reliable, skilled, and hard-working. The second piece of the puzzle was more revealing. She used her credentials to access public records and found a hospital admission record. His son, Leo Reyes, had been admitted to St. Jude's Children's Hospital 6 weeks ago, the very hospital named on the donation jar. The final piece fell into place when she submitted a request for his son's medical billing information, citing her position as his potential legal counsel. The records that came back were staggering, page after page of charges, codes, and fees that amounted to a mountain of debt. And then she saw it. A recent charge for an experimental treatment, flagged with a note, "Insurance coverage denied, patient responsibility." The amount due for the initial dose was $157. Corinne stared at the number. It was the exact amount Marcus, the cafe owner, had reported stolen. She went back to the jail the next day. This time she didn't bring up legal strategy. She simply sat down, slid a copy of the hospital bill across the table, and waited. Ansel glanced at it, then quickly looked away. "This isn't about a donation jar, is it, Ansel?" Corinne said softly. "This is about Leo. Tell me about the medicine." That was all it took. The dam broke. Ansel buried his face in his hands, and his shoulders shook with deep, ragged sobs. Through tears, he told her everything. He spoke of Leo's sudden illness, the terrifying diagnosis, the endless nights in the hospital. He described the soul-crushing meetings with doctors and insurance agents, the feeling of drowning in a sea of paperwork and debt. He explained how the new treatment was their last real hope, and how the insurance company had denied it with a cold, impersonal form letter. He told her how he had pleaded with the hospital, offering to set up a payment plan, but they had refused. The policy was clear: payment up front. "I had nothing left," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I looked at my boy and I couldn't let him go because of a number on a piece of paper. I failed him." Corinne listened, her heart aching for him. "You didn't fail him, Ansel," she said firmly. "The system failed you." For the first time since his arrest, a flicker of something other than despair appeared in his eyes. It was a tiny glimmer of hope. That hope, however, was about to be tested. The story had taken on a life of its own, thanks in large part to Marcus, the owner of the Grind and Steep. He was positioning himself as a pillar of the community, giving interviews to news crews and writing self-righteous posts online about the sanctity of charity. "We're a small business trying to do good," he said in one interview, standing proudly in front of his cafe. And this man violated not just our trust, but the trust of every person who donated to help those sick children. The public, fed this simple narrative of good versus evil, rallied behind him. The cafe's social media page was flooded with messages of support, while Ansel was vilified in the comments section. He was a monster, a degenerate, the lowest of the low. When Corinne contacted the hospital's administration, she was met with a wall of corporate indifference. Their legal team was polite but firm. Mr. Reyes's financial situation was unfortunate, they said, but it was a separate issue from his criminal act. Their billing policies were standard, and they could not make exceptions. The district attorney's office, feeling the heat from the public outcry, came down hard. They offered Ansel a plea deal, but it was brutal. Plead guilty to a felony theft charge, and they'd recommend a sentence of 1 year in county jail. A felony on his record would mean he could never work in a skilled trade like carpentry again. It was a life sentence of a different kind. Corinne presented the deal to Ansel, explaining the consequences. He just nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'll take it," he said, his voice flat. "Let's just get it over with." "Ansel, no," Corinne pleaded. "This isn't justice. We can fight this." But the fight had gone out of him. The public shame, the looming jail time, and the constant worry for Leo had worn him down. "It's my fault," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I did the crime. I have to do the time." He was ready to give up, to let the system crush him, believing it was the only way to atone for his sin. Corinne walked out of the jail that evening feeling a cold dread. Ansel was about to sign away his future, and she was running out of time. She went back to her office and stared at the pile of documents on her desk. The hospital bills, the insurance denial, Ansel's spotless record. The story wasn't in these papers, it was in the space between them. The public only saw a thief. She had to make them see a father. She picked up the phone and called a number she hadn't used in years. A reporter at the local news station, a woman known for her tough but fair investigative journalism. "Clara," she said, "I have a story for you, and it's not the one you think you know." The reporter agreed to meet. Corinne laid everything out on the table, and as Clara read through the documents, her expression shifted from skepticism to shock, and finally to anger. The next evening, the local news aired a special report. It didn't open with Ansel's mugshot. It opened with a picture of a smiling, healthy Leo before his illness. Clara's voiceover was calm and measured as she presented the facts, not just the theft, but the crippling medical debt, the insurance denial, and the impossible choice Ansel had faced. Corinne knew this was Ansel's final test. He had to face the world not as a caricature, but as a man. She convinced him to do an on-camera interview from the jail. It was a huge risk. He was terrified, his hands shaking as the camera operator counted down. But when he spoke, his voice was steady. He didn't make excuses. "What I did was wrong," he said, looking directly into the camera. "I know that. I broke the law, and I'm deeply, truly sorry for it. But I need you to understand, I was trying to save my son's life." He described the agony of watching his child suffer while being told that the only thing standing in the way of a cure was money. The interview was honest, heartbreaking, and powerful. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. The narrative didn't just shift, it flipped completely. The cafe's social media page, once a place of praise, was now flooded with angry comments accusing Marcus of profiting from a man's desperation. A boycott was organized. Within days, his community hero status had evaporated. A GoFundMe page, started by the news station for Leo's medical expenses, exploded. Donations poured in from all over the country. In less than 48 hours, it surpassed its goal, raising enough to cover not just the new treatment, but all of Ansel's outstanding medical debt. Faced with a public relations disaster, the hospital's administration buckled. They issued a statement announcing they would forgive the entirety of the Reyes family's debt and were launching a full review of their financial assistance policies. The district attorney, seeing the tide had turned, quietly reached out to Corinne. The felony charge was off the table. They offered a new deal, a single misdemeanor with no jail time, only probation and community service. Months later, a healthy, energetic Leo ran through their small apartment, his laughter echoing off the walls. He was in remission. Ansel was working again, his old boss having rehired him the day the charges were dropped. The leftover money from the GoFundMe sat in a new bank account. At Corinne's suggestion, they had used it to establish a non-profit organization, Leo's Fund. It was dedicated to providing small emergency grants to parents facing the same impossible choices Ansel had. The final scene of Ansel's redemption wasn't in a courtroom. It was back in the familiar, sterile halls of St. Jude's Children's Hospital. He was there not as a desperate father, but as a volunteer. He walked into a room where a young mother sat crying, an intimidating stack of medical bills on her lap. He sat down beside her, introduced himself, and handed her a check from the fund. It wasn't much, but it was enough to cover the upfront cost of her child's next treatment. In her eyes, he didn't see judgment or pity. He saw gratitude. And in that moment, he knew he had finally found his own way back. He had been rescued, and now he was the rescuer. Ansel broke the law, but was his action truly wrong given the circumstances? I'm really curious to know where you stand on this, so please share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story made you think, consider sharing it with someone who appreciates narratives that explore the gray areas of life. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back with another story soon.